Today I'm going to be talking a little about Mary, or a lot about Mary, I should say. I was trying to decide. Shelley sat around the shine-up seat and said, who wants to teach which books and what, and I ended up getting assigned today before I chose a book. And then I was trying to decide on a book and sort of went to that classic Episcopal thing that some priests do, and that is we went to the liturgical calendar. Yesterday is the Feast of St. Mary, and I said, oh, well, then we're talking about Mary, for sure. I'm going to actually start with the prayer, the collect for the Feast of St. Mary the Virgin. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, you have taken to yourself the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of your incarnate Son. Grant that we, who have been redeemed by his blood, may share with her the glory of your eternal kingdom through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right, so we're going to try and cover Mary and 3 books today. Or something like that. We'll see how this goes. All right, so scripturally, we know almost nothing about Mary. Believe it or not. People think they've got a lot, but pretty much we know she's the mother of Jesus, and we about cap out there. She shows up 12 times in the Gospel of Luke. Pretty much all in the first 2 chapters. It's the birth story, and then she loses Jesus in the temple when he's a young man. And then she disappears until the cross. 5 times in Matthew, once outside the birth narrative, twice in Mark, and then twice, but John never actually names her. Even at that last moment where he looks at the beloved disciple and says, here is your mother, here is your son, sort of takes care of mom from the cross, but never uses her name. So it's a fascinating thing. Scripturally, she's just not there. She's best known for a response to Gabriel in the Gospel of Luke, Let It Be. It's not just a Beatles song. We know almost nothing other than she's the mother of Jesus, wife of Joseph. She appears with Jesus' brothers and sisters on at least 3 occasions. And we don't know her parents' names. Apocryphally, that is later, we added the names Anne and Joachim. If you've ever heard those before, there's usually a St. Anne's church that you'll see from time to time, and it's actually St. Anne, the mother of Mary. The last time we see her is actually in the upper room for Pentecost. That's it. That's all we know about Mary scripturally. We got lots of other info that has trickled through the tradition, but that's it. Is that surprising to folks? Does that sound about right? Yeah. Not surprising. Okay, good. Good. So, there are some things the church has specifically taught about Mary. 2 of them everyone agrees on. The other 3, not so much. The first is called Theotokos. It's literally God-bearer. Theo in Greek, theos is God, and tokos, or token, is to bear, to carry. So, she is literally the God-bearer, or the mother of God. Believe it or not, that was a debate for about 50 or 100 years at the beginning of the church, whether or not to call her that. Finally, everyone agreed. That didn't seem to be too far off. The other thing that everyone agrees on, virgin birth, part of the creeds, part of the scripture, and there's pretty universal agreement on that part. That's it. That's only agreements on Mary. Then we get into the extra stuff on Mary. Assumption of Mary, that is, she goes straight to heaven after death. In some cases, actually the assumption is that she didn't have to die. God just raised her up and she floated up to heaven, where she became Queen of Heaven, as you'll sometimes hear in the Catholic Church. This didn't become doctrine until 1950 with Pope Pius XII. So obviously a very recent addition for the Assumption of Mary. Then the one that people always get confused, the Immaculate Conception. It's not Jesus, it's Mary. The Immaculate Conception has to happen, and it was approved by Pius IX in 1854. I'll give you all a quick history of the Immaculate Conception. The problem that everyone had was good old St. Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine of Hippo, came up with this idea of original sin. And original sin pretty much translates just almost biologically from parents to child. And this is how really twisted this can get. There is a belief that because the husband and wife look at each other with lust, then therefore original sin is carried on to the child. We had to get away from that, so the Immaculate Conception is that Joachim and Anne, the people we don't actually know their names, but the parents of Mary made love without lust and therefore avoided original sin, so therefore Mary is without original sin. The Episcopal Church does not really buy this one. But it's important to the Catholic Church. The Immaculate Conception matters to them. Then the last one, perpetual virginity of Mary. And I don't even know how to pronounce the Smalkid Articles of 1537. This is after Martin Luther and company started protesting and the Protestant schism had broken open. And so this was one of those great things about, oh, we'll show you. The idea is that Mary was always a virgin and never had a problem. My favorite response to that was from, I can't think of the author's name. It just flew out of my head. That's all right. An author who's known for being a dry wit. And I wish I could remember. Oh, well, it's not going to come. Anyway, he famously said, to believe in the virgin birth is certainly miraculous, but to believe that a husband and wife united in marriage lawfully never made love is just stupid. And the Episcopal Church isn't real big on the perpetual virginity of Mary either, in part because of the scriptural witness. And this is really where that debate started happening. They said, Jesus has brothers and sisters. The text says very clearly he has brothers and sisters. They show up at different points. And so we sort of go, I would guess they came from Mary and Joseph. And Catholic teaching and tradition, they're stepchildren of Joseph. Oh, whoa. They're stepchildren of Joseph. And Jesus is an only child kind of situation. That's the teaching, the official teaching of the Catholic Church. So you can already see we add lots of stuff to Mary. The term that Ivan will use with that is a MacGuffin, which this is actually a movie term. But here's my thesis for today, or my idea. Mary, because we know so little about her, tends to, by every generation of Christians, her story gets retold according to what that generation of Christian wants to believe, or what they're struggling with. She's sort of this, as a character, she almost doesn't matter. What's more important about Mary is that she's there and she's human, but we're going to lay our stuff on top of her and talk about her in ways that a lot of times have nothing to do with what was going on in first century Palestine. Has anybody ever heard the term MacGuffin? Oh, a couple of folks. All right, so it comes from, oh my gosh, my names are totally flying out of my head today. What's the, Alfred Hitchcock, there we go. Hitchcock came up with the term, and he told this story for it, so this is a great story. It might be a Scottish name taken from a story about two men on a train. One man says, "What's that package up there on the baggage rack?" And the other man answers, "Oh, that's a MacGuffin." And the first one asks, "What's a MacGuffin?" Well, the other man says, "It's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." The first man says, "But there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands." And the other one answers, "Well then, that's no MacGuffin." So you see that a MacGuffin is actually nothing at all. But anyway, so the sort of technical definition of MacGuffin is something or someone who pushes a plot forward in a movie or story. Think about the Ark in Indiana Jones. The Ark's almost irrelevant. It's just people running around after the Ark. That's the interesting part. It's the same, that's the whole idea of a MacGuffin. It doesn't really matter. In the same way, Mary is almost unimportant. What the church says about Mary and how we argue about Mary ends up saying a whole lot more about us than it does about Mary. Any questions on that? That's sort of where we're going here. The interesting thing about Mary right now is, for a very long time, And I'm sure most of you can remember this growing up. Ooh, there it goes. And now we're going to go back the other way. So Mary's been a person for intense devotion for Roman Catholics for a very long time. But there's been a rapprochement here in the last couple decades from evangelicals and Reformation churches are starting to look at her again and value her, talk about her. Ironically, I think probably for the same reason that many Roman Catholics do, and that is if you have a church that has to have male priests and can be completely male-centric, at some point you have to have a conversation, well, what about women, and where do you go for that? Do you go to Mary? The Episcopal Church has not struggled with Mary as much, certainly recently, because, well, we have female clergy and we have a different idea of how female leadership looks and breathes and acts in the church. But it goes back and forth. All right, so we're going to review 3 books. Here's the thing about Mary. I'm not a Mary scholar. I like Mary. She's fun. It's fascinating to read how people view her and the lenses through which people view her. The 3 books that I'm going to review today, 2 of them I found in the salvage bin. That's sort of where I typically find books about Mary. She's on the for sale rack for $1.50. Because, I don't know, that's just how she ends up. But one is Our Lady of the Lost and Found from 2001, The Handmaiden and the Carpenter from 2006, and The Testament of Mary from just a couple years back. All right, first up, Our Lady of the Lost and Found. So this is a very easy book. The idea is there's a disaffected Protestant author who actually has to be the author as well. But she's writing sort of about herself. She comes home one day to discover a woman who is Mary, who's just standing or claims to be Mary, who's standing in the middle of her living room. And since May is a busy month for the Mother of our Lord, being one of the great feast months, she needs a week off and like to rest at her home. That's the whole plot. It's nothing but Mary shows up and says, I need a break. Can I stay for you for a couple weeks? And she goes, sure. So what comes after is a combination of a history lesson, a faith reflection, and a novel of female friendship. It's written playfully, but with powerful images. Basically, she's there, and so the author alternates in chapters between going, oh, here's some history about Mary, and then Mary said this to me, and then, oh, it reminded me of this, and it sort of goes back and forth in a flow. It's an interesting little book. So their conversations become the source of the book. And again, the author sort of does research. Mary's suddenly living with her, and as a Protestant, she goes, I don't know anything about Mary. So she goes to the library and checks out some books and starts reading some history, trying to figure out exactly what all this means. So there are 2 things I want to focus on from this book that I find particularly fascinating. One is a sequence where when Mary takes a break, and she shows up in this dress, this beautiful blue dress, covered in milagros. These are milagros, which is Spanish. I'll click the next thing. Milagros are Spanish for miracles. And the way it works in Latino culture is if you have a prayer and you're worried about it, you go to a statue of Mary or Joseph or Jesus, and you pin a milagros to their garment, which is typically a cloth garment, as a representation of your prayer. To give you an idea of how popular this is still, at Our Lady of Guadalupe, they have statues of the Virgin, and they'll put these out, and they'll remove around, I think they said last year was 28,000 milagros from her dress annually. Prayers representing different things. So for instance, if you have like a broken leg, then you'll pin a leg to Our Lady's clothes. Or maybe you had a successful knee surgery, so you put a leg on her clothes as well, thanking her for successful surgery. It's sort of the model of prayer. But there's a beautiful sequence where the author and Mary are sitting there and they're sort of taking the milagros off of her dress, and they're talking about what each prayer represents, and then carefully putting them in a box and making sure that they're sort of secured. Which I didn't actually know how milagros work, so part of that was just the fun of learning about milagros. Do you have a question, or are you just talking? You're fine. You can talk.
reminds me of being down in Falfurus and going to the small HEB down in Falfurus, right in the front door, during hunting season and stuff. But these Our Lady of Guadalupe candles.
Oh, sure, yeah, there's tons.
It's just everywhere.
They are. All right, so the next one gets a lot deeper. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which she actually talks about a lot in this book. Whew, here we go. All right, so the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is a technical term that the more you attempt to analyze, it's a scientific term, the more you attempt to analyze one aspect of an item, the less you can know about the other aspects of an item. So in other words, the more precisely you know where an object is, the less you can know about its momentum. In other words, if you've analyzed and said it's right here, then it's really hard to say, well, it's going 50 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour because you're so focused on one part of it. All right? Anybody watch Breaking Bad? Heisenberg. Believe it or not, this is actually what, when they wrote Breaking Bad, the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty is what they based the show on. That you can never know exactly someone's motives if you're only focusing on one part of them. It goes back and forth. That we're always more dynamic. Anyway, so as we jump from pop culture to Mary and back, basically, this often gets also mixed up with the observer effect, but that the measurement of a system often, in fact, impacts the system. It's really hard to sort of analyze something and do that in a vacuum and not have that impact you and it impact the mechanism going on. It's a big concept. Questions about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle or the observer effects? This is what she does with it. So she starts struggling with her doubts, and again, she doesn't use a name, she's the author. She comes to a realization, and this is all a quote. Maybe this internal monologue, where she's asking questions and doubting and going back and forth about why is Mary here, what's going on in my life, why am I doing this? Why does this monologue need to be a monologue at all? Maybe it was meant to be a dialogue. Perhaps for all these years, I had not been talking to myself. Maybe I had been praying all along. Perhaps it was more important to ask these questions than to have all the answers. I finally understood that just as, according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, a system is changed by the observer, so I too was being changed forever by asking the questions in the first place. I finally understood that my uncertainty and my doubt were gifts that made me the perfect candidate for faith. Nice. So the idea really is here that sort of with Heisenberg and with this uncertainty principle, doubt is part of faith, and you can only get to faith through doubt, is her argument. And especially with Mary sitting in the living room, that's the only way you can have that conversation anyway. So it's a beautiful reflection. Questions about that? This is sort of her process. I keep leaning on that thing. I'm going to fall right over. Any questions? It's a beautiful reflection. So this is sort of how this book worked. Now, my thesis, to go back to, no, I'm just way high, but that's okay. My thesis that Mary is a MacGuffin, I don't know if this book would have been written post 9/11. This is a book about doubt, uncertainty, and actually being comfortable with doubt and uncertainty and not being polarized or feel like you have to have the perfect answer or it's one thing versus another thing. It's dealing with ambiguity, being comfortable with ambiguity as part of faith. So, yeah.
So, if you have doubt, you're a better Christian?
I don't know if she would say that. I wouldn't say that. I would say it's just part of the Christian life if you have doubts. If you have something that you're not sure about in the whole complexity of faith in life, not in any particular area. You may be completely comfortable with the virgin birth. You may be comfortable with the Assumption. You may be comfortable with a host of those things, but then go, I don't know what the hell God's doing in the Middle East. Good. But being comfortable with that ambiguity, I would argue, is a hallmark of being a faithful Christian. That is, trying to at some point say, I don't know, and God's got it under control, or somehow this is part of this and I'm going to work through that process. Yes, ma'am. It's possible, yeah. If you've got it all perfectly figured out, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say you have an idol, but you certainly, it's hard to say if you have reached perfect knowledge at the same time. I'd certainly be hesitant to say that I've got it all figured out. It's getting idolous. Oh, I don't think it's impossible to write the book after 9/11. I just think, and you'll see with the other two books are about Mary written post 9/11, and both are polemics. Both books about Mary written after this time went from being comfortable with ambiguity, having conversations. I mean, part of this whole book is written in very conversational tone where she goes, Mary, I don't know about this. And she goes, don't worry about it. It'll all take, there's this comfort that you're not going to know, and it will be okay, and it can be in between. Post 9/11, both books written after 9/11 aren't. They're not comfortable with ambiguity. They want to know an exact answer and why. And I would argue our national debate is governed by that now, so it's a reflection of how our national debate goes. I mean, almost everything in our world now, you either have to be liberal or conservative, or it goes this way or it goes that way, or you're Christian or you're a Muslim or whatever it is. And having that place in between where I go, well, I'm a Christian, I can love my Muslim brothers and sisters, seems to be almost forbidden to a certain degree, or at least something that people go, well, how does that work? You're supposed to believe only Jesus. And it's just a struggle. I think it could be written now. I think it should be read now. But it's just, again, authors tend to tap into what's going on in the culture, and they tend to apply it to Mary very posthumously. And so it's just sort of happens. Somebody else had their hand up as well? Oh, yeah.
In this morning's paper, Dallas Morning News, the points section has a discussion by Muslims about what needs to happen between the Christians and the Muslims and the Muslims of the Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting two-way street. It'd be worth reading.
I'll have to check it out. Yeah. All right, so pre-9/11 doubt and struggle with faith, essential to Our Lady, the lost and found, but it's replaced. In this case, we're going to go to The Handmaid and the Carpenter, which was first. It's an achingly sincere and loving portrait of Mary and Joseph, and Elizabeth Berg's The Handmaid and the Carpenter. The Handmaid and the Carpenter, the next two books are both novellas, really. They're short books. My wife and I actually will typically read this book every Christmas. It's a quick little book. It takes about half an hour to an hour to read. It's quick. But it's a fabulous little book, very grounded in the first century. There we go. It's a slow book. It's a meditative book. It seeks to connect that slower agrarian pace. And really, in this case, the biblical story is intact with natural responses to the worries and concerns that are raised. Let me give you some examples of that. No one is sure if they could trust Mary, this 13-year-old girl, and her claim to have seen an angel. They're all sort of skeptical and worried about this idea of her miraculous pregnancy. In fact, there's some pointed questions about if she didn't have an affair with this guy or with that guy, people that she'd been flirting with or hanging out with. So it's just a very natural imagining of what that first century probably was like and would happen today. If a girl was 13 and got pregnant, we'd all do the same thing. Well, she was pretty sweet on John. She talked to him a lot or whatever. And I bet it was John, or the kind of stuff that would happen anytime. Joseph is in love with Mary and is betrothed to her, and of course finds out, and he's deeply wounded. A very natural human response. Her father, Joachim, escorts his daughter to their relative Elizabeth, and he's not sure if he should believe his daughter, but he's shameful. He's worried that shame is going to be on his family and on his potential grandchild. And then the women, Elizabeth, Mary, and even Anne, are portrayed as believing the miracles, and the men are practical and worried. So, probably natural as well, right? I'm not getting too deep into this one because it's very topical. But the work here is one of faith. Berg has a love and respect for Mary in the narrative. She follows a troubled romance with style and grace, choosing to make Joseph a young man. Typically, a lot of times you'll hear Joseph being like 30 or 40 and much older, and Mary being the young sort of 13, 14-year-old. In this case, it's almost a Romeo and Juliet story. They're both young, 16, 14, somewhere in that range for the both of them, both very much in love. Incidentally, we don't know how old Joseph was. The reason Joseph is always portrayed as older, it's to fit the Catholic model that he had children first. That's it. That's the only reason why we tend to portray him as older. You got to have some kids in there, and he has to have lost his first wife to get married to Mary. The other is, sometimes they'll also say he was older simply because he disappears completely from the narrative, so they have to go, well, he died, so he had to be older. Like, that's the only reason you could die, is if you're older. But she does give Mary and Joseph a happy family. She does make that break. But she chooses to have Joseph die a young death. And unbelievably, it's a beautiful moment where Mary and Joseph are there and he dies in her arms. And Mary says, I got to go downstairs and tell Jesus, but he probably already knows. He always knows these things. It's beautiful. I mean, just that's the sort of way this piece is written. Very reflective, very meditative, and very faithful in that way of Jesus is still Jesus. Mary and Joseph can be the characters they are, and they're all interacting as a family and dealing with very natural conversations. Her narrative allows for the miraculous, but steers towards rooted in the natural. There are no streaks of light or angels flying in windows or anything like that in the narrative. So I'll go back to this. So this book, again, goes from that sort of Mary who's just hanging out and doing her hair and doing laundry, and the handmaid and the carpenter who's a very modern, natural hangout kind of person. This goes all the way back to the first century, completely tells the story in a very faithful, dedicated prose and love story in that first century. And it's elegant and it's beautiful. But again, we're now dealing with post 9/11. It's almost like we've got to defend Mary and the story and make sure people know the story and exactly the way it floats. That's not to say this book could have written well before or well after, but the timing does speak a little bit to how it flows. The Testament of Mary is by an Irishman, novelist and playwright, Colm. I believe it's Tobin, but it might be Tobin. It completely swings the other way. We go from a faithful, loving portrait of Mary that it would fill any Catholic storybook or any Christian book for the last 2,000 years. This one swings all the way to the other side. This is a Mary who is skeptical, she's angry, and she is under house arrest by the disciples as they try to ask her questions and write the Gospels. That's this whole show. That's the whole book. It was turned into a play. It is actually here produced this fall in Dallas. It was right around Good Friday. It was last spring, but it was right during Holy Week and a variety of those times. And I heard it was I didn't get a chance to get over there. I heard it was a fabulous thing. It's the Testament of Mary, so it's very much Mary writing her own narrative, Mary telling her own story, and the production, as I understand it, is always done just as a monologue. There's one woman on the stage telling the story from the book, but here's the story of where I am and what I believe. And none of it has to do with Jesus. That is, all the sentimentalism that Handmaid and the Carpenter is just gone. It's out the window. Mary's grieving, she's angry, she's disaffected. She watched her son die and she's pissed. It's that easy. She pointedly prays to Artemis, a Greek goddess instead of the God of Israel. She refuses to pray to that God of Israel. She views the Gospels and their composition as an intrusive act and really as a theft of life. This is my story. How dare you tell my story? This is my son's story. How dare you tell his story? The Gospel writers are never identified, but they do understand Jesus is God. But we almost get the idea because of the way Mary's telling the story that I wouldn't know if you go so far as to say it feels like they're making it up, but they've got a story to tell, and they're going to ignore anything that doesn't go along with the story to tell in this version. For her, Mary knows how the story went, and in her mind, her son provoked the authorities, and she knew how it would end. And basically, she keeps showing up. There's that famous moment where in the Gospel of John, Jesus comes and they're both at the wedding, and Mary comes and says, please turn the water into wine. We got to keep the party going, right? The classic Episcopal moment, if there ever was one. Well, in this version, she goes and begs him to get the heck out of there. I know what you're getting ready to do. You have to leave. You're going to get too much attention if you do anything here. There's almost a belief from Mary's perspective that he can change water to wine, and he's going to do something miraculous, but she just doesn't want to, what's going to happen. This happens to every Messiah that gets put up in Israel. They always kill them. Don't be the next guy who gets killed trying to be the Messiah. So she goes up trying to stop his preaching and his teaching. There is a moment in Scripture, and it's not altogether clear. Jesus, it's been interpreted a number of different ways, but Mary and Jesus' brothers and sisters show up, and there's a line in there that actually, when our almost presiding bishop, our presiding bishop-elect came, Michael Curry came, he talked about how Mary wanted to have Jesus institutionalized. They thought he was crazy. The authenticity of that part of the text is under question. So some script, you will read it sometimes, and that line will say, they were coming to have him institutionalized, and then other times when you read the text in other translations, it doesn't have that part. It just says they came to find Jesus. And their intentions are not listed. What that means basically is we have some really old texts that have it and some that don't. But either way, there is a history that Colm is playing with here, that Mary was always skeptical, and that as Michael Curry talked about very profoundly, they all thought he was crazy, which probably isn't too far afield, really. If you're running around declaring you're God, or at least you have an idea of what God's doing, you're going to get yourself in trouble anytime. But she tries again, and then they keep asking her, they keep prodding her. They ask her specifically about the crucifixion, and she will not speak about it. Instead, she talks about random things that she observes while she's there, except for observing her son being killed, and that is, she remembers this really terrible and horrible moment where there's a caged hawk, and a cage that's too small for it, and this cruel man keeps feeding it rabbits, but the hawk doesn't want them, so it kills them, but just sort of leaves them twitching in the cage kind of sequence, obviously as a metaphor for what's going on with Jesus. But it's a really, really hard few paragraphs, chapter to read as she talks about it. In the end, she is not the faithful mom. She doesn't stay to the end. She leaves. She can't watch her son die in this testament. In the end, Mary determines it was not worth it. That is her final word in the text. It was not worth it at all. So again, we have two books, both written about Mary, the two biggest and most successful commercially books written after 9/11, and they literally take it to one extreme or the other. Either Mary is the faithful, loving, doting mother and wife in The Handmaid and the Carpenter, or she is absolutely bitter and abandoned and cannot have any less faith if she tried, probably kind of mom in the Testament of Mary.
We're giving us two perspectives that we've seen that in the traditional churches. We've seen that viewpoint coming out. In other words, the book, my question is, the book is written by individuals the thought process. So I'm assuming they got the thought process because if you've been connected or had something to do in the church environment. So my question is, if those two extremes
Right.
are present in our corporate worship,
I think it depends, again, and this sort of gets to the next. So what are we to do with these wildly different points? Again, I'd argue she's a MacGuffin. The stories are about, and I'll get to your answer, don't worry. Reflect the artist and the time more than they say about her. So the real thing to think about as an Irish playwright writes about Mary, you have to consider that Ireland 10 years ago was 80%, 90% Catholic. Attendance was 4 times what it is today. And it was before the sex scandal that literally brought down the Church of Ireland. And not sort of. I'm talking about like they have literally, it's something like, I think attendance is now 1/3 of what it was about a decade ago. So if it's a reflection of the artist, Colm is absolutely tapping into the Irish reflection, not just on Mary, but on the church. Mary's getting saddled up for what the evils the church has done, and is becoming that voice that says it wasn't worth it. Look at all these horrible things that have happened because of what the church has done. So I wouldn't say that the voice is within the church in Colm's case. It's about the church, but not necessarily within the church. Or if it is, it's within those who have been disaffected from the church, who are really questioning. And I do think that's a lot of what's going on in our culture now. Is you have people who are raised in the church and are starting to go, what's the point of the church? Every time it always seems to be back in the same old spot and the same old debates and not helping those who need to be helped. The great late 20th and early 21st century cry against the church, especially amongst millennials, is hypocrisy. You have this great, huge, wonderful campus and you spend millions of dollars to have it, and the poor are still poor all around you. It's not an invalid critique either. But it is that sort of reflection that we have to deal with and try and struggle with. And then you have the other side, the knee-jerk response side, that says this tradition matters, the faith matters, the story matters, and we need to preserve all three that the handmaiden and the carpenter reflect and hold up as sacred and holy, and maybe needs to be told again in a better way so that people can understand it. Yeah.
Why do you say that 9/11 brings circumstances?
9/11 is typically the mark where you can go back and read an op-ed piece from 2000, and there's conversations about what do we do, and there's far more comfort with ambiguity. It's a polarizing moment, and it became polarizing because suddenly fear became part of our national discourse on a level that it simply wasn't before. It maybe was during the Cold War, but it had sort of dissipated the 90s and so when 9/11 happened, and most sociologists will claim this as that moment, that it's when things became hyper-polarized. Not immediately, but over the next 3 or 4 years, things became more and more polarized, and it became this conversation where either you're for this or you're against this. There was not you can be in the middle, or you can not be sure, or any of those kinds of comfort with ambiguity. Everything became a very polarized model and argument. Fox News came after 9/11, not before.
I tend to agree with I think too on social media. I mean, so everyone has a voice and everyone.
Absolutely. Social media is the other part of it.
Certainty, like I'm certain. The opposite, for me, almost like the opposite of faith is not doubt, it is certainty. I mean, it's just, I have an opinion, this is it, I close my mind.
Right. Yeah, social media certainly takes off in the aughts, but it's also social bullying takes off in the aughts.
Yeah,
it's not just I get to say something. It's if I, God forbid, turn a phrase wrong, suddenly there's 8,000 people that are commenting on my page or on the commercial or on whatever to talk about how dare they X, Y, and Z. And so that place for, it's ultimately mob think.
Yeah, conversation.
and conversation disappears, and this sort of mob mentality takes over to a certain degree. Obviously, we've always done this to a certain degree. It's not to say that 9/11 is that hallmark moment that perfectly divides all of this, and before we were an enlightened society who had conversations about everything. No. But it's just to realize that we were going in one direction, and that it shifted our focus in ways that we're still trying to understand and deal with now. Some of that easy to understand, some of it really, probably historians will be writing about it well after we're all gone, trying to understand some of it. Let's see. So the big reason I think Mary gets used is because she's the most human and the most unknown part of the gospel stories. In other words, she's easy. She's there, and we know her name, and we know exactly broadly what she did, but we have to try and fill in those gaps. We want to fill in those gaps. It's a natural human response to sort of go, well, what happened with Mary from 11 or so, when Jesus was 11 to 30, as much as we want to know what happened with Jesus for a number of those years. So it's just easy to sort of write our hopes, our dreams, our fears, and aspirations on her. These books are no different, and again, I sort of just go through each of these now. Our Lady Lost and Found speaks about the search for faith and comfort and ambiguity. The Handmaid and the Carpenter is a faithful rendition. It's a little bit of comfort food, maybe, to a certain degree. I don't know if y'all have read any of those articles, but one of my favorite articles about everything that happened with, what's the name of the woman who cooks with lots of butter? Y'all shouldn't have. Paula Deen, there we go. I love that that's all it took. One of the great conversations I saw, and I can't remember who wrote it, but there was a great op-ed piece about Paula Deen that was talking about she was a nobody until 9/11, and then everybody wanted comfort food. The rise of Paula Deen came because everybody wanted comfort food and the old-fashioned stuff, because in a world where people run planes into buildings is a little too scary place to be. Yeah. Supper's ready. You got it. Exactly.
Reflecting on how Mary is seen as a part of our culture, I can remember back in sort of the height of the feminist movement, sitting in a group that included Roman Catholic nuns, and one of them said to me, I've never been all that crazy about Mary, but she's always God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot of, to sort of carry this argument, Mary, during the feminist movement, became really a problematic character because she said, let it be, like, whatever you want to do, God. And the feminist movement couldn't do anything with that. What's that? She questions first. But there's lots of analysis when the feminist movement came along because Mary was seen as too agreeable. And again, it doesn't say anything about Mary. Poor Mary gets blamed for being too agreeable, and there's an angel in front of her saying, like, your son's going to be God. Okay. And she has questions and she's unsure. That's all we know. As probably any of us would be at any given moment for that. But we lay all this stuff on top of her, asking and asking. And then again, the sort of last one, Testament of Mary, cynicism, frustration with tradition and faith reflects the writers. A lot of these international conversations. What's going on with faith? Ultimately, for all of them, there aren't any easy answers. But the important thing I would argue is to recognize that Mary gets a whole lot of blame or credit. God bless her, either way. She deserves the credit of bearing Jesus, of being faithful and responding. And like I said at the beginning, we agree on two things: the virgin birth and that she bore God. That's plenty. God bless her, that's plenty. She was a mama, and she did the best she could. Results seem to have gone pretty well, I would argue. All the other stuff says more about us and what we're struggling with, which is not bad, but it's more what we're dealing with than what Mary dealt with. It's important to take the two apart, make sure we understand who we're talking about in each given case. Any other final questions, comments?
In the novel, the opening
Mm-hmm.
So Mary enters the stage and she's got something swaddled in her arm. And so as an audience member, you think it's the baby. And she puts it on the table and it's a lovely bread.
Oh, nice. No, it's not in the book, but that's a nice staging.
Very, I had you from that moment.
I bet. I bet. Yes, I think we maybe get out of the bread of life finally next week, or maybe one more week. Speaking as a preacher, the 6 weeks of the bread of life get a little old, probably for those listening as well. All right, my friends. Well, thank you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.